I was 15 years old when I figured out that the land was trying to warn us. The hard part was that nobody in Harrowbend would listen to a boy with a shovel. The harder part was that I couldn't blame them. The Vane family had farmed the same 40 acres for 3 generations. Not great land, never great land. It sat low at the eastern edge of Harrowbend County, Kansas, where the clay ran thick and the topsoil was thin, and the creek that bordered the southern fence line had a habit of running generous in wet years and stingy in dry ones. Every season, the Vanes worked twice as hard as their neighbors for somewhere between half and 2/3 the yield. That was simply the arithmetic of the place. And every Vane who had ever worked it understood that arithmetic without needing anyone to explain it. My father, Thomas Vane, had bad knees and a worse cough. The knees had started going when he was 38, 2 bad harvests and 1 bad winter layered on top of each other in a way the body sometimes refuses to forgive. The cough had come later and stayed, the kind that worsens every November and never quite leaves by April. He moved through the farm the way a man moves when he has learned to work around pain rather than through it, deliberate and careful and without complaint. I had never once heard my father complain about his body. I'd heard him complain about seed prices and equipment failures and one particularly dishonest equipment dealer in Salina, but never about the knees or the cough. He simply carried what he carried and kept moving, and I had grown up understanding, without anyone ever saying it plainly, that this was what the farm required and that he had decided, somewhere before I was born, to be equal to what it required. My mother, Martha, kept the books and kept the house and kept the family together through a kind of quiet authority that I understood even as a child but could not have named. She was not a soft woman. She was not a hard woman either. She was the kind of woman who knew exactly what things cost and never pretended otherwise, and who loved her family with a practicality that was more sustaining than sentiment. She made the numbers work every year through a combination of discipline and small sacrifices that she never itemized and never mentioned. On the years when the numbers did not cooperate, she found other ways, and she did not discuss those ways with anyone, including my father, until they had already worked. I was the oldest of 3. My sisters were 11 and 8. They did not yet understand the full weight of what the farm required, and I was glad of that. Understanding comes soon enough on its own, and there is no reason to accelerate it. In the first week of March, a letter arrived from Oak Hollow Lending in Salina. Gerald Marsh, branch manager, had written it in the careful language that bankers use when they want to say something unpleasant without saying it plainly. The farm carried a remaining debt of $87,000, secured against the land and equipment. The letter noted that the loan agreement contained a performance clause requiring minimum harvest yields at 60% of the 3-year rolling average. If the upcoming harvest fell below that threshold, the bank reserved the right to initiate asset recovery proceedings beginning November 1st. My father read the letter at the kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he set it face down on the table and went outside to check on the south fence, which did not need checking. He stayed out there for 40 minutes. When he came back in, he didn't mention the letter. My mother picked it up, read it once, and put it in the folder where she kept documents that mattered. She did not say anything. She didn't need to. That night I lay in my bed and looked at the ceiling and did the arithmetic. 60% of the 3-year average on our land, with the equipment we had, in a year that had already started dry. The numbers were not comfortable numbers. I ran them 3 different ways hoping for a different answer and did not get one. Then I lay still for a long time listening to the wind move around the corners of the house and thinking about what I had found in the barn 2 weeks earlier. Before the letter arrived, before any of this had a deadline attached to it, I had found the journal. It happened the way important things sometimes happen, not through intention, but through proximity to the right moment. A late February storm had taken down a section of the north barn wall, not catastrophically, but enough to require attention before the spring rains came in earnest. While I was moving the accumulated debris of 3 decades, broken harrow tines, rotted fence posts, a pile of burlap sacks that had dissolved into something closer to soil than fabric, I found a wooden crate pushed into the corner behind what remained of my grandfather's old disc cultivator. The crate was not remarkable. It was the kind of crate that farms accumulate the way attics do, filled with the residue of intentions that were never completed. Inside this one, there were 2 glass mason jars with their contents long evaporated, a rusted tin that had once held tobacco, and a cloth bundle wrapped in twine that had gone brittle with age. I carried the bundle to the workbench and unwrapped it carefully. It was a journal. The cover was dark with age and the leather had dried and cracked along the spine, but the pages inside were intact. The first entry was dated March of 1891 and written in a cramped, deliberate hand that pressed hard into the paper as if the writer wanted the words to stay. The name at the inside cover was Caleb Vane. My great-great-grandfather, a man I had never known, never been told much about, never thought to ask about in the way that young people fail to ask about the dead until it is too late to ask anyone who knew them. I had seen his name once on a faded photograph in the hallway, a man standing in front of a field with his hand shading his eyes against the sun, and that was the sum total of what I knew about him before that February evening. I brought the journal inside and sat at the kitchen table and read it by the light above the stove, while the February wind pushed against the windows and my father slept in the next room. Caleb wrote the way a man writes when he is not writing for an audience but for himself, plain and specific and without embellishment. He recorded the temperature each morning. He recorded what the creek was doing week by week. He noted which fields held moisture longest after a rain and which drained fastest, and what the soil looked like in cross-section when he dug a post hole in each location. He was an unusually careful observer of the land he worked, not poetic about it, not philosophical, simply attentive in the way that people who depend on a thing for their survival sometimes learn to be attentive to it. In the summer of 1894, a drought had come to this part of Kansas that lasted 14 months. Caleb described it the way he described everything, in spare, specific sentences that somehow made the absence of water more terrible than any dramatic account could have managed. The creek down to nothing by July, the well dropping a foot a week through August, the Garvey farm on the North Road going silent one morning, the family simply gone, the door left open, a child's shoe in the yard. He wrote that down too, just the facts of it, just the shoe, sitting in the yard with no foot in it and no explanation. But Caleb had survived, and in the final section of the journal, in handwriting that was more urgent and less even than the rest, he had written down exactly how. The land tells you what it needs before the sky fails to give it. Watch the low places. Water finds the low places first and leaves them last. A man who holds water on his land holds time. Time is the only thing that beats drought. And then, underlined twice with such pressure that the pen had nearly cut through the page, dig before the dry, never after. I read those 4 words many times. I read them, and then I looked out the window at the dark bulk of the fields and the darker shadow of the low corner. The corner we never planted because it flooded in wet years and cracked in dry ones, and had never been anything but trouble. The corner everyone had always written off as the worst part of an already difficult piece of land. I sat with the journal open in front of me and thought about what it would mean if those 4 words were right, and what it would cost if I acted on them and they were wrong, and what it would cost if I did not act on them and they were right. I sat with that for a long time. Tucked into the back pages, folded into quarters and soft with age, was a document I almost missed. A land use agreement dated September of 1889 issued by the Federal Land Office and signed by Caleb Vane, confirming rights to the natural subsurface water flow crossing the eastern portion of the property. The language was formal and archaic, but the meaning was clear enough. Caleb had registered a water right on this land, a documented legal claim to the underground current that moved through the low corner. The document was faded and the fold lines had gone white, but the signatures and the seal were intact. I didn't know yet what it meant in practical terms. I folded it carefully and put it in my notebook. Then I thought about it for 2 weeks before I went to find a shovel. Those 2 weeks mattered. I was 15 years old and I had learned, partly from my father and partly from some instinct I could not have traced, that acting on one piece of evidence was how people made expensive mistakes. I spent those weeks doing something that surprised Mrs. Addie Crane at the Harrow Bend Public Library when I walked through the door on a cold Tuesday morning and told her what I was looking for. Drought records, I said. Historical ones, for this county and the ones adjacent, and anything available on water retention in clay soils. Mrs. Crane was somewhere past 60 and had been the librarian in Harrow Bend for longer than I had been alive. She had the quality of a person who has spent decades surrounded by information and learned to move through it efficiently without losing respect for any of it. She didn't ask me why I wanted what I wanted. She simply found what she could find and stacked it on the table in front of me and left me to it, which was exactly the right thing to do. There were agricultural extension reports from the 1930s, a regional soil survey from 1962, A water table study commissioned by the county in 1989 that had apparently been filed and never meaningfully acted upon, and a thin, self-published pamphlet from a farmer named Howard Briggs who had distributed it at a county fair in 1978 arguing, to an audience that was not interested, that Harrowbend sat on a drought cycle that repeated on an interval of roughly 30 to 35 years. The pamphlet had a handwritten note on the inside cover from Mrs. Crane's predecessor, something to the effect that this was an interesting local document worth preserving. Briggs had been dismissed as an eccentric. His pamphlet had been politely received and politely set aside. I read it 3 times. Then I opened my notebook and made a table. The documented droughts in the county, going back as far as the library's records extended. 1894, 1927, 1956, 1988. I stared at the intervals for a long time. 33 years, 29 years, 32 years. The last serious drought on record had been 1988. That was 35 years ago. I closed my notebook. I didn't feel anything dramatic. What I felt was quieter and more frightening than drama. The plain arithmetic weight of a pattern that had been sitting in the county records for decades, available to anyone who cared to look, and which apparently nobody had thought to look for. Howard Briggs had looked. Howard Briggs had written it down and distributed it at a county fair and been laughed at for his trouble. And his pamphlet had sat in the library for 45 years waiting for someone to need it. I walked home from the library and I started to dig. I chose the low corner of the eastern field, the 40 by 60 section that nobody had farmed in my lifetime because of its tendency to flood in March and crack in August. I drove stakes into the 4 corners on an April morning and set my shovel into the ground and pushed it down with my boot. My neighbor Dale Hurst happened to be driving past on the county road with his grandson. Dale was 63 years old and had farmed his 200 acres since he was 20, working the same ground his father and grandfather had worked, and he had the settled confidence of a man who has made the same decisions for 4 decades and been right enough times that he has stopped questioning the process. He pulled his truck to the gravel shoulder and leaned out the window. "What are you planting there, Eli?" he called. "Not planting," I said. "Digging." "Digging what?" "A pond." A silence followed that had some weight to it. Dale looked at the staked rectangle. He looked at me. He looked at the rectangle again with the expression of a man who has heard something that does not compute and is giving it a second chance to make sense. "Boy," he said finally, "that is your best flat ground." "Yes, sir." "You planning to grow fish instead of corn?" I set the shovel into the earth and pushed it down with my boot without answering. Dale pulled away from the shoulder and drove on. By noon, he had told 4 people what he had seen. By evening, all of Harrowbend had heard, and the story had acquired in the retelling the particular quality that stories acquire when they involve someone doing something that the community has collectively decided is foolish. It became a kind of entertainment, a thing to shake your head at, a thing to feel mildly sorry about on behalf of the Vane family, who had enough trouble without their boy tearing up their best flat ground to dig a hole. Marcus Hurst, Dale's son-in-law, drove past 2 days later. Marcus was 38, with an MBA from a state university and 6 years of managing the financial side of the Hurst operation behind him. He was not an unkind man in the way that deliberately unkind men are unkind. He was the kind of man who had learned to cover uncertainty with the language of competence, and who sometimes, in the process of performing confidence, said things that landed harder than he intended. He slowed his truck when he saw me working and watched for a moment from behind the windshield. Then he drove to the Milford Diner on the county road, where 7 or 8 farmers took their coffee most weekday mornings, and he said what he said loudly enough for all of them to hear. "The Vane kid has decided to dig a pond instead of planting. 15 years old and thinks he knows something the rest of us don't." I heard it repeated back to me the following morning, once from the carver boy at the feed store and once, more carefully, from Silas Park, who farmed 80 acres on the north side of the road and had a reputation for being honest even when honesty was inconvenient. Silas pulled his truck to the edge of the field on a Saturday morning and watched me work for several minutes before he spoke. "People are talking," he said. "I know," I said. He looked at the excavation. "You know something they don't." It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It was the sentence of a man leaving a door open. "I think there might be a drought coming." I said, I told him about the library, the drought intervals, Howard Briggs and his ignored pamphlet. I did not tell him about the journal. Not yet. The journal felt like something that belonged to the family until I understood it better. Silas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he pushed his cap back on his head and looked at the rough rectangle of turned earth I had managed so far. "How deep are you going?" he asked. 6 feet at center, I said. Sloped banks, clay liner on the bottom and sides, willows along the north edge for root stability. He regarded me for a moment with an expression I could not entirely read. Then he walked back to his truck and drove away without saying anything else. 3 days later, he came back with a notebook of his own and a list of questions that told me he had been thinking hard about what I said. What nobody outside the Vane property could see that spring was the work that went into the pond beyond the digging itself. I had read enough of the agricultural extension reports to understand that a farm pond is not simply a hole that holds water. It is a system. A body of water changes the humidity of the air immediately surrounding it. It holds subsurface moisture in the soil within its influence. It gives the birds and insects that sustain a farm's ecological balance a reason to stay in a place even when conditions turn hostile. The clay liner was the foundation of everything. I packed it in layers, working from the deepest section of the excavation upward along the sloped banks, compressing each layer before adding the next, checking the thickness against the specifications in the 1930s extension report. The process was slow and physical, and I didn't mind either of those things. My father came out on the days his knees permitted and worked beside me in silence, which was his way of saying something he did not have words for. On the days he could not come out, I worked alone and did not think about what the rest of the county was saying about what I was doing. The willows came from the creek bed 2 miles south. 7 saplings I dug by hand on a Saturday morning in early May and replanted along the northern bank where they would do the most good, pressing each one into the bank with both hands, firming the soil around the roots the way you treat anything you intend to last. I chose the northern bank because the extension report specified that deep-rooted trees on the prevailing wind side would stabilize the bank and draw additional groundwater into the pond's influence over time. I was not guessing. I was following instructions written by people who had already made the mistakes. My mother watched the pond take shape over those weeks with the expression she wore when she was calculating something important, not skepticism, not approval. The expression of a woman running a serious assessment of an uncertain proposition. One evening in late May, she came to the edge of the excavation while I was cleaning the inlet channel and stood looking at the few feet of murky water that had accumulated at the center. The pond was not much yet. It was a wound in the earth with aspirations, but the shape of it was there. "Your father showed me the journal," she said. I nodded. She looked at the water for a moment. Then she said she had something I should see. She went inside and came back with a manila envelope that had gone soft with age. Inside was a document from 1962, a soil and water assessment conducted by a private geological firm. Commissioned by my grandfather in connection with some transaction, the document did not explain. The assessment confirmed the presence of a natural subsurface water flow crossing the eastern portion of the property and classified it under Kansas water law as a priority 4 natural water right. I held it in both hands. Then I went inside and found the folded paper from the back of Caleb's journal and brought them out and held them side by side in the evening light. 2 documents, 63 years apart. 2 different sets of hands measuring and recording the same underground current moving through the low corner of the Vane property, the corner where I was digging. I did not know yet what the legal weight of these 2 documents might be. I put them both in my notebook and said nothing to anyone outside the family. Martha watched me put them away and said nothing either. We both understood, without discussing it, that the right moment for those documents had not arrived yet. By the first week of June, the pond was holding 4 feet of water at its center, and the willows were leafing out with the confidence of young trees that have found a place they intend to occupy. A pair of killdeer had appeared and were working the muddy shallows with the systematic focus of birds who understand a good situation immediately. I walked the creek on the south fence every Saturday morning and measured the depth at the same point each time, a spot where the bank was stable and the bottom flat enough for a consistent reading. In March, the creek had run 8 inches deep. In April, 6. In May, 4. In the first week of June, 2 inches of moving water in a creek I could not remember ever running less than 6 inches through a summer. I wrote it down. I wrote everything down. The last morning of June, Gerald Marsh from Oak Hollow Lending drove out to the Vane property in his own car. A dark blue sedan he parked in the yard with the precision of a man uncertain about the ground beneath him. He stood looking at the pond before Thomas came out to meet him. I stayed inside but watched through the kitchen window as Marsh pointed at the excavation, as my father said something, as Marsh opened a folder and showed my father something inside. That evening, Thomas told me what had been said. Marcus Hurst had contacted the bank. He had suggested that the excavation on land held as collateral might constitute a modification of the asset without lender approval, potentially triggering a review clause in the loan agreement. Marsh had driven out personally to assess. My father's voice was level when he reported this. His voice was always level. "What did you tell him?" I said. "I told him to drive south 2 miles and look at the creek," Thomas said, "and to come back next month and look again." There was a silence. Marsh left without making any formal notation in the file. My father said, "But the clock is still running toward November." I went to bed that night and lay in the dark and thought about Marcus Hurst at the Milford diner counter, saying what he had said, and about the letter from March, and about the 2 documents in my notebook, and about the 4 underlined words pressing through the page of Caleb's journal. I thought about all of it in the particular way you think about things at night, when there is nothing useful you can do about any of them until morning. Then I got up before dawn and went back to work on the pond. Old May Fulton, who was 81 and had long since stopped working her own land, but still walked the county road each morning with the unhurried authority of someone who has earned the right to observe without participating, stopped at the fence one Tuesday in late June and watched me clearing the inlet channel. She watched for several minutes without speaking. "What do you know that they don't?" she said finally. I looked up. The question surprised me because it was framed as curiosity rather than accusation. Most of the questions I had been getting that spring were framed as accusations. I'm not entirely sure yet. I said honestly, "But I think I know something." May nodded once, slowly. "Your great-great-grandfather was the same way," she said, quiet about it until he wasn't, and she walked on. I stood still for a moment after she went because I had not known that anyone in Harrow Bend still remembered Caleb Vane. And the fact that May Fulton did, that she remembered him as someone who had been quiet about something until the moment came when he wasn't, settled in my chest with a weight that was not unpleasant. Then I went back to the channel. By the time July arrived, the pond was holding nearly 6 feet at its center, and the willows along the north bank were established enough to cast a narrow ribbon of shade across the water in the afternoon. I had shaped the entry channel to direct runoff from the higher surrounding ground inward rather than away, and the gravity-fed outlet I had constructed from salvaged lumber could be opened or closed with a wooden board to control the water level. None of this was sophisticated technology. All of it was old. The same principles appeared in agricultural documents going back before the Civil War. Methods largely abandoned when electric pumps and drilled wells made gravity and patience seem obsolete. I had simply read the old documents and done what they said. Silas came back in the last week of July with his measuring tape and a younger man I did not recognize, his nephew from Pratt County who had been asking questions about water retention after his own well started dropping faster than expected. Silas walked the perimeter of the pond slowly, measuring and asking specific questions about the liner thickness and the willow spacing. I answered everything he asked. At the measuring point on the south fence, the creek was running less than an inch deep on the last Saturday of July. It had never in my memory run that low that early in the summer. I measured it, wrote it down, and said nothing to anyone outside the family. The songbirds began to leave the eastern fields in the second week of July. Not dramatically, not all at once. The red-winged blackbirds thinned out first from the tall grass at the field margins, then the meadowlarks, then the bobolinks. They were not migrating. It was 2 months too early for migration. They were simply moving toward water with the quiet pragmatism of creatures who make no argument about what they need and waste no time once they have decided. I noticed one morning that there were more birds around the pond than I had ever seen in one place on the property. They moved through the willows and across the muddy margins, and through the air above the water in a continuous living motion that was almost musical. I watched them for a while. Then I walked inside and wrote down the date and underlined it twice. The land had been trying to warn us for months. I had been listening. Most of Harrow Bend had not, and in the pale, bleached-out sky above the county, which had been losing its depth of color since mid-June, something was changing that no pump and no MBA and no bank clause could address. The sky was forgetting how to rain, and the only water that anyone in this county had deliberately saved and held and protected sat quiet in the low corner of the Vane property, full to its clay-lined banks. while the world around it grew slowly and then undeniably thirsty. What none of them understood, in those last days of July, when the county still believed the rains would return, was that the land had already made its decision. The creek on the south fence had stopped arguing, the birds had voted with their wings, and somewhere beneath the surface of every field in Harrow Bend, the water table was doing what water tables do in the years that follow a pattern nobody bothered to read. It was leaving, quietly, without announcement. The way important things often go until the moment they are gone and the absence becomes the loudest thing in the room. August came in hot and stayed, not dramatically hot, not the kind of heat that announces itself with thunder and spectacle. It was the flat, persistent heat of a sky that had decided to withhold, a pale and washed-out expanse that old farmers in this part of Kansas recognized the way they recognized the particular silence before a machinery failure. The sense that something load-bearing had stopped working and the structure had not yet caught up with the fact of it. The afternoon thunderstorms that had been arriving irregularly through June and July became less certain, then less frequent, then by the second week of August absent entirely. The county did not immediately call it a drought. People in farming communities have a careful relationship with that word. They know its weight. They know what it carries behind it, the history of it. The foreclosures and the departures and the topsoil that blows away and does not come back. They used other words first. Dry stretch, hard summer, late rain. The rains would come in October, the old-timers said, and they said it with the confidence of people who had been right before. Eli had heard his father use those same phrases in previous dry summers. But this August, Thomas did not say them. He sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the sky with a look that was not panic and not resignation, but something between the two. The look of a man who has run the numbers and does not like the answer but has not yet decided what to do about it. He watched the sky the way you watch something you have trusted for a long time and are beginning to reconsider. The creek at the south fence was running at the depth of a thumbnail on the first Saturday of August. 3 days later it was dry stone and cracked mud and the smell of something ancient rising from the exposed bed. Mineral and old and honest about what it was. The stones at the bottom had begun to show a white crust where the water had evaporated fastest. Standing on the bank and looking at it, Eli felt something that was not surprise, because surprise requires a degree of disbelief, and he had not been disbelieving. What he felt was the particular weight of a thing confirmed, which is heavier than most people expect it to be. He walked back to this pond. The water had dropped since July, within the range calculated for evaporation in a dry stretch. The clay liner was holding. The willows had roots deep enough now to draw from below the surface rather than from the pond itself, which was what the old extension report had predicted and what he had built toward, at the margins where the mud stayed damp. The tracks of every bird and animal within half a mile told a clear story about where the water was and who had figured it out. Silas and his nephew came by on a Tuesday morning. They stood at the edge of the pond and Silas looked at it for a while before speaking. "Creek's gone," he said. "Since Thursday," Eli said. Silas wrote in his notebook. His nephew looked at the pond and then at the surrounding fields and back at the pond with the expression of someone doing arithmetic they do not want to do. "Mine went 2 weeks ago," the nephew said quietly. "I thought it was just my property." "It is not just your property," Eli said. Silas looked at him steadily. "How long do you think it runs?" Eli thought about 1894 and 1927 and 1956 and 1988 and the spaces between them. "Long enough that what you do right now is what matters," he said. Silas nodded once and wrote something down. They walked the perimeter slowly, measuring, observing, and then drove away. Eli watched the truck shrink on the county road and turn back to the inlet channel. Across the road, 200 acres were beginning to show what a dry August does to corn without a backup water source. The leaves curled at the edges, the slight inward roll that is a plant's first response to water stress, the agricultural equivalent of beginning to ration. The color was off by a shade, the green with a yellow note underneath that becomes visible only when you know what you're looking for. Eli had been walking corn rows since he was old enough to keep up with his father, and he knew what he was looking at. Marcus drove past the Vane property on a Thursday afternoon without slowing, but Eli saw him look, saw the quick turn of the head toward the fields, toward the pond, toward the ring of relative green that had become visible around the water. Marcus looked for only a second and then faced forward and drove on. and something in the set of his shoulders through the windshield told Eli that the look had registered something Marcus was not ready to reckon with. The Hearst operation had moved aggressively that spring. Marcus had negotiated a forward contract with a regional grain aggregator, locking in the price for 80% of the anticipated harvest from the 200 acres in exchange for a cash advance he had used to purchase an automated irrigation system. The system was well reviewed in the trade publications and had been installed by a certified technician in April. It drew from the Hearst well, drilled in 1974, which had never in its operational life shown any sign of unreliability. Marcus had checked the historical output data. The numbers had been consistent for 50 years. The well began dropping in the third week of August, 3 feet in the first week, within the range the manufacturer described as normal seasonal variation. Marcus called the service technician, who ran a diagnostic and found no mechanical fault. Natural fluctuation, the technician said. It will stabilize. It did not stabilize. By the end of August, the automated irrigation heads in the outer sections of the Hearst fields were running at insufficient pressure. The system compensated by extending cycle length, which drew more water per day from the well, which accelerated the drop. Marcus called the manufacturer's service line and was told to reduce the schedule and allow the aquifer to recharge overnight. The aquifer was part of the same subsurface system that fed the low corner of the vein property. The same flow that Caleb had registered in 1889 and a geological firm had measured again in 1962. That system was under a stress that no overnight pause could address. It was not a mechanical problem. It was the land. Dale walked his fields on a Sunday morning in late August and did not like what he saw. The outer 40 acres on the north side, the section the irrigation system was struggling to reach at full pressure, showed stress that went beyond normal dry summer response. The curl in the corn leaves was not the cautious inward roll of a plant conserving moisture. It was tighter than that, more desperate, the role of a plant making decisions about which parts of itself to sacrifice. He had been farming for 40 years. He knew the difference between a plant rationing and a plant losing. Dale stood in the middle of the north section with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at his fields the way you look at something that has always been reliable and has suddenly revealed a limit you did not know it had. He was not a man who showed what he felt easily. He had the deep, settled stoicism of someone who has learned that panic does not fix equipment and does not make rain and does not serve any purpose that could not be better served by thinking clearly. But standing there, in that field, in the haze and the heat, and the particular quality of silence that a failing crop makes, he felt something he did not have a name for. It lived near fear without being fear, because fear implies that the outcome is still uncertain. And what Dale was beginning to understand was not uncertain at all. He turned south and looked across the county road, half a mile away. The line of willows along the north bank of the vein pond moved in the small morning breeze, their leaves still green and full. Behind them the darker green of the vein cornfield, diminished by the drought the way everything was diminished, but standing, not the color of something that had given up. He turned away from it. He had nothing to say to that sight yet, and he knew that when he did have something to say, it would not be comfortable to say it. Marcus called an emergency meeting with the grain aggregator in the second week of September. The forward contract required delivery of a minimum quantity by October 15th. If the Hearst harvest fell short, the contract included a penalty clause that had seemed irrelevant in the optimistic spring negotiations and was now entirely relevant. The aggregator's representative drove out from Wichita and walked the fields and said the things that representatives say when numbers have gone wrong and there is no mechanism to make them go right again. The conversation lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, Marcus sat in his truck in the field access lane for a long time without starting the engine, looking at the dashboard and doing arithmetic in his head that kept coming out the same way no matter how he arranged it. The irrigation technician returned in mid-September, and this time the diagnostic returned a different result. The well output had dropped below the system's minimum operational threshold. The automated heads were delivering less than 40% of the designed volume. The technician recommended shutting down the system to prevent pump damage and switching to manual spot watering of the highest priority sections. Manual spot watering 200 acres from a diminished well in September was not a solution. It was a gesture toward one. Marcus spent 3 days making calls to water hauling services across the region, pricing what it would cost to supplement the failing well with trucked water. The numbers came back and he looked at them for a long time and closed the spreadsheet without saving it. Dale found out about the well output from the technician, who mentioned it at the feed co-op in town without realizing it was not already known between the two men. Dale drove home and sat in the kitchen and waited for Marcus to come in from the fields. The conversation between them was not loud. Dale sat at the table with his hands flat on the surface and listened while Marcus laid out the full picture: the forward contract, the penalty clause, the well output numbers, the cost of every alternative he had priced. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Dale was quiet for a moment. "You committed 80% of anticipated yield before you confirmed the well could carry the load through a dry year," Dale said. "The system specifications showed it was adequate based on historical output." Historical output, Dale said. "Not this year's output." Marcus said nothing. Dale stood and went outside and stood on the porch looking at his fields, the ones he had farmed since before Marcus was born, and he looked at them with an expression that Marcus, watching from the kitchen window, had never seen on the older man's face before. Eli was clearing the outlet channel on a Thursday morning in the third week of September when he heard Marcus's truck slow on the county road. He recognized the engine sound. He kept working. The door opened, boots on the gravel shoulder. Marcus walked to the fence and stood on the other side of it. He was dressed the way he usually dressed, clean clothes and boots that had not seen a full day of field work in some time, and he carried himself with the careful posture of a man who has not yet decided what kind of conversation he is about to have or what he is willing to concede in it. Eli kept working. After a moment, Marcus said, "Pond's held up well." "It has," Eli said without stopping. Eli moved along the channel, pulling debris from the edges, keeping the flow clear. Marcus watched him work. The silence between them had texture to it. "I need to ask you something," Marcus said. His voice had a quality that was different from the voice Eli had heard reported from the Milford diner in April. The certainty was gone from it, replaced by something that was not quite humility but was in its neighborhood. Eli stopped and straightened and looked at him. "There is a water source on this property," Marcus said carefully. "The geological assessment from the 60s. I know about it because I looked at the county records 3 years ago when I was researching the Hearst well depth. The same subsurface flow runs under both properties." Eli said nothing. "I need to know if you would consider a water-sharing arrangement," Marcus said. "A formal one, compensated. The Hearst fields are failing." Eli looked at him for a long moment. He thought about the Milford diner and the words that had traveled from that counter to the feed store to Silas Park's careful and gentle report of them. He thought about the letter Gerald Marsh had sent at Marcus's suggestion, the one raising the question of unauthorized modification of collateral. He thought about his mother putting that letter in the folder without a word, and about the number 87,000, and about the date November 1st. "I am not in a position to share water I may need," Eli said. Marcus looked at the pond, then he looked at Eli. The expression on his face was not pleasant to see, not because it was angry, but because it was not. It was the look of a man who has arrived at a reckoning he delayed too long and is now receiving it without the cushion of time he would have preferred. "I understand," Marcus said. He walked back to his truck. He sat in it for a moment, then drove away. That evening, Marcus drove to Salina and had the conversation with Gerald Marsh that he should have had in the spring. The well output projections, the forward contract, the penalty clause, the cost of every alternative. Marsh listened, asked 3 questions, and then went quiet in the way that bankers go quiet when they are calculating what exposure looks like from their side of the desk. "Your operation is going to show a significant loss this year," Marsh said. "Yes." "And the $340,000 system," Marsh said. "It is operational," Marcus said. "The well is not." Marsh wrote on his legal pad, "How much of the Hearst acreage are you projecting as total loss?" Marcus gave him the number. It was not a comfortable number. Marsh wrote it down and looked at what he had written. That same week, on a Wednesday evening when Thomas had gone to bed early because his knees had been worse than usual, Martha came to where Eli was sitting at the kitchen table and set a plain envelope in front of him. She sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table. "I found this when I reorganized the cabinet last month," she said. "I was going to wait, but I think now is the right time." Inside was a document from 1962, a soil and water assessment conducted by a private geological firm. Eli recognized the kind of document immediately. He read it slowly. The assessment confirmed the presence of a natural subsurface water flow crossing the eastern portion of the property, and classified it under Kansas water law as a priority 4 natural water right. He set it down. He went to the barn and got his notebook and brought it back and took out the folded paper from Caleb's journal, the 1889 Federal Land Agreement, and laid them side by side on the kitchen table under the lamp. 2 documents, 63 years apart, 2 sets of hands measuring and recording the same thing. Martha looked at both of them. She pressed her palm flat on the table beside them, not touching either one, and was quiet for a long moment. "Whatever these mean," she said, "we should understand them before anyone else does." Eli nodded. He understood what she was not saying, which was that the right moment for these documents had arrived, and that it needed to be handled carefully. The October rains the old-timers had predicted did not come. The sky in the first week of October was the same blank pale expanse it had been since August, and the temperatures dropped enough to slow moisture loss from the soil, but not enough to change what had already happened. The corn that had not received supplemental water was past saving. Even the sections Marcus had prioritized for spot watering were yielding a fraction of what the forward contract required. 3 farms on the southern edge of the county began quiet conversations with their lenders. The Carver family drilled a second well at considerable expense and found it produced less than the first. 2 families whose roots in Harrow Bend went back generations began conversations about what came next that none of them had expected to be having. The word that had been avoided all summer was now in every conversation: drought. Each time it was said at the diner or the co-op or the church, someone seemed to remember, almost involuntarily, the boy who had spent the spring and summer digging a pond on his family's worst ground while everyone watched and shook their heads. Silas drove to the Vane property on a Saturday morning and asked Eli to walk him through the clay lining process in full detail, because he had identified 2 low sections on his property that might work and wanted to understand the technique well enough to execute it himself over the winter. Eli walked him through everything. Silas wrote it all down and drove away, and Eli noticed that the slightly uncertain quality Silas had carried in the spring was gone. He moved now with the purposefulness of a man who has decided on a course and is simply gathering what he needs to complete it. Dale came to the Vane property on an October morning when the air had the cold clarity of a fall that is committed to itself. He drove in without calling ahead and parked near the barn and stood outside his truck, which was the county signal that you wanted to talk but would wait to be invited. Eli came out and saw him standing there looking at the pond. They stood without speaking for a while. The willows had turned in the October way, a soft amber that caught the low morning light and held it. The pond surface was dark and still. A small flock of mallards had arrived overnight and moved at the far end with the unhurried ease of birds that have found exactly what they came looking for. "I owe you something," Dale said. Eli waited. "I laughed at you in April," Dale said. "I told people what I thought of what you were doing. And then Marcus told me about the conversation at the fence, what you said to him." Eli looked at the pond. A lot of people laughed. He said, "I didn't hold it against them." Dale turned his cap in his hands. "You could have said yes to Marcus." He said, "You could have made the Hearst operation pay for what he did with the bank letter. You had reason to." "I needed the water," Eli said. "And I wasn't certain I had enough to spare." Dale looked at him. "That was the only reason." Eli considered it honestly. "That was the main reason," he said. Something moved across Dale's expression. Not a smile, but the look of a man who has received an honest answer when he had braced himself for a generous one and found the honest one more valuable. "How did you know?" Dale said. "Back in April, how did you actually know?" And Eli told him, not the abbreviated version he had given Silas in July, the full account. The storm damage and the crate behind the cultivator and the cloth bundle and the journal. Caleb's cramped handwriting pressing hard into pages from 1891, the library and Mrs. Crane and the stack of documents and Howard Briggs's pamphlet that nobody had read, the table of intervals, the creek measurements every Saturday from March through the moment it stopped, the birds in the second week of July. All of it laid out plainly, the way he had seen it himself. Not as prophecy or genius, but as observation, patient and incremental and one careful piece at a time. Dale listened without interrupting. When Eli finished, the older man was still for a moment. "My grandfather mentioned drought cycles," Dale said, almost to himself. "Said they came around. I never asked him to explain it." Eli said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to that. Dale put his cap back on. "Could another pond be dug?" he said. "On my land, before spring?" "Yes," Eli said. "I can show you how." Gerald Marsh drove out to the Vane property on the 28th of October, arriving without calling ahead, parking in the yard and walking to where Thomas was working on the equipment shed. They spoke for several minutes. Eli watched from inside the barn where he was checking the outlet boards before winter. Marsh walked to the edge of the Vane cornfield and stood there for a while. He looked at what 6 months of deliberate water management had produced in the worst dry year the county had seen in 35 years. The yield was not what anyone had hoped for in the spring, but it was above the 60% threshold. Thomas had calculated it 3 times to be certain. Marsh looked at the pond. He looked at the willows, the field, the ring of relative green around the water that was visible from the county road. Then he walked back to his car and drove toward Salina. The following week he signed a 12-month extension on the Vane loan without conditions and mailed it without ceremony. Thomas set it on the kitchen table in front of Eli that evening without a word. Eli looked at the date and the terms and the signature and set it down. He looked at his father. Thomas picked up his coffee and looked toward the window, and the look on his face was not triumph and not relief, but something quieter than either. The expression of a man watching something he planted in difficult ground hold against the season. Martha came in from the next room and read the document where it lay on the table without picking it up. Then she went to the cabinet above the kitchen desk and opened the folder of important things and placed the document inside and closed it. Outside, the pond sat in the fading October light, full to its clay-lined banks. The mallards were still on the water. The willows had shed most of their leaves, gold scattered across the bank and floating at the margins, and the bare branches caught the last of the sky and held it briefly before the light left the day entirely. The November deadline came and passed. The Vane land was still Vane land. The land does not keep score the way people do. It does not remember who laughed and who did not, who prepared and who trusted the good years to continue because they always had. It only keeps what it is given and withholds what it is not. That is the entirety of its accounting. And it was doing that accounting before anyone in Harrow Bend County was born and would continue after all of them were gone. What changed that November was not the land. What changed was the quality of attention that people brought to it, and the change was the slow, unglamorous kind that comes not from inspiration but from consequence. The rains returned in late November, not dramatically, not as an answer to prayer, but as a quiet resumption of something that had been interrupted. 3 inches over 2 weeks, falling in the cold, patient way that late autumn rain falls in Kansas, soaking in rather than running off, beginning the long work of recharging what the summer had taken. The creek on the south fence of the Vane property showed a thread of moving water in the first week of December. Eli measured it on a Saturday morning, 1 inch, moving. He wrote it down and underlined it once and closed the notebook. The pond received those November rains with the indifference of something that had never stopped believing water would return. The level rose 2 feet in a week and settled. The clay liner had done its work through the long, dry months without being asked to do anything else, and it continued doing it now. The willows, bare and patient along the north bank, had their roots woven into the clay by this point, and they would come back in the spring with more authority than they had shown in their first year. Dale had asked his question in October, and Eli had answered it. In the first week of December, before the ground froze past working depth, Dale brought in a crew with a small excavator and broke ground on a pond in the low southwest corner of his property. Eli drove over on a Tuesday afternoon and walked the site with the crew foreman and explained the grade requirements and the depth and the importance of the clay liner done in layers rather than all at once. The foreman listened carefully and asked 3 questions that were good questions and wrote the answers down. Dale stood at the edge of the excavation and watched his crew work. Eli stood beside him. The two of them had a way of occupying the same space now that had not been possible in April. A kind of companionable quiet earned through what the summer had done to both of them, though in different ways and from different directions. "Your great-great-grandfather," Eli said after a while. "May Fulton told me he was the same way, quiet about what he knew until he wasn't." Dale watched the excavator move through a turn. "My grandfather knew Caleb," he said. "Mentioned him a few times when I was young. Said he was a man who paid attention to things other people didn't consider worth watching. I never asked what things." Eli nodded. "I should have asked." Dale said, "It was not self-pity. It was just a fact being acknowledged." They watched the crew work for a few more minutes and then Eli drove home. It was Patricia Webb who found the missing pages. She had come to Harrowbend at Mrs. Crane's suggestion. After the drought, the librarian had called the county agricultural extension office and described what had happened on the Vane property with the precision of someone who knows how to make information land. Patricia drove out from Salina and met with several farmers before she came to the Vane place. And by the time she sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and Caleb's journal in front of her, she had enough context to understand what she was reading. She was 30 years old and held a graduate degree in soil science from Kansas State, and she had the quality of someone who went into science because she genuinely wanted to understand how things worked, not to have credentials that said she did. She read the journal slowly, going back over certain passages, making notes in the margins of her own notebook. When she reached the 4 underlined words, she sat still for a moment. "How old is this?" she said. "The first entries are 1891, Eli said. She looked briefly at the ceiling. "We have satellite soil moisture data now, drone imaging, predictive drought algorithms that cost the state a significant amount of money. And this man in 1891 was watching the same indicators from the ground. He was watching the land," Eli said. "The land doesn't change that much." Patricia nodded slowly. She examined the pages where the journal ended abruptly, the ragged inner margin where something had been removed. She ran her finger along the torn edge carefully. "How many pages do you think are missing?" she asked. 8 or 10, Eli said. "Maybe a few more." She photographed the torn edge and the last intact page and several others. Then she closed the journal and set it on the table. "I want to look at something," she said. "The county keeps historical document archives at the courthouse annex in Salina. Agricultural records, property filings, estate documents transferred over the years. It is not well organized. But I want to look." Eli said that was her business to pursue however she thought best. She thanked Martha for the coffee and drove back toward Salina. 3 weeks passed. December settled over Harrowbend with the gray, committed cold of a plains winter, and the farm shifted from the urgency of the growing season to the quieter work of maintenance and preparation. Thomas worked on equipment in the shed on the days his knees allowed it, which was more days than the previous winter. Martha updated the ledgers and kept the house running with the same unremarkable competence she brought to everything. Eli split wood and checked the pond level weekly and spent 2 evenings reading a November extension newsletter that contained an article on cover crops and winter soil health that seemed relevant to the North Field. He didn't think about Patricia Webb and the missing pages every day. He had absorbed, somewhere in the reading of Caleb's journal and the months of patient observation that followed it, that the things worth waiting for require waiting, and that filling the interval with restlessness is a waste of the energy that the work needs. Patricia called on a Thursday morning in mid-December. Martha answered and brought Eli in from outside. He took the phone and listened. She had found them. They were in the county archive in Salina, in a flat storage box labeled Miscellaneous Agricultural Documents, 1880 to 1920, that had apparently not been opened or cataloged in several decades. The pages from Caleb's journal had been removed and placed there in 1952 by a county clerk named Dorothea Hallam, who had left a handwritten note inside the box explaining her decision. Mrs. Hallam had received the pages as part of an estate filing when a Vane family member submitted documents to the county. She had separated them from the estate file because they contained the names of neighboring families in a context she judged might cause distress if the documents became part of the accessible public record. She had preserved them rather than destroying them because she believed they had historical value. She had not returned them because she could not think of a way to do so without causing the very distress she was trying to prevent. 70 years later, in a storage box in a building that smelled of paper and cold concrete, Patricia Webb had found them. She came back to the Vane property on a Saturday with a folder of photocopies. Thomas was at the table when she arrived. Martha stood at the counter and did not pretend she was not listening. Patricia opened the folder and set the copies down. The missing pages were the final section of Caleb's account of the 1894 drought. What came after the 4 underlined words was what Caleb had observed happening to the farms around him when the drought ended and the accounting was done. He had not written it dramatically. He had written it the way he wrote everything. The Garvey farm had been sold at a loss to a land consolidator from Topeka. The Briggs family had held on, but sold the North 40 to cover debt. The Atwell place had changed hands twice in 2 years. And the Hearst farm, the original 80-acre parcel that the current Hearst property had grown from over 4 generations, had been sold in the spring of 1895 by a man named Edward Hurst, who had farmed it since 1881 and had not dug a pond and had not held water and had run out of options in the second year of the drought. Edward Hurst had loaded his family and what he could carry into a wagon and moved to a town in eastern Kansas where his wife's brother ran a hardware business. He had sold the land for less than he owed on it. The current Hurst farm, the 200 acres that Dale had worked for 40 years, had been assembled over subsequent decades by Dale's grandfather, who had bought back the original parcel, piece by piece, and added to it over 30 years of careful work. Dale had grown up on land that his grandfather had rebuilt from a loss his great-grandfather had suffered because he had not prepared for what the land had been trying to tell him. Thomas read the pages without speaking. Martha set her hand on the table beside the folder, not touching it. Eli sat and looked at the photocopied handwriting of a man born more than a century before him and thought about what it means to write something down when you do not know if anyone will ever find it. Patricia said she wanted to speak with Dale Hurst before this became part of any published account. She felt he deserved to know privately first. Eli agreed immediately. Patricia drove to the Hurst property that afternoon. Dale was in the equipment shed. She introduced herself and explained her connection to the Vane property and the drought research, and then told him what she had found and why she had come to him first. She gave him the folder of photocopies and stood quietly while he read. He read, standing up, still in his work coat, the folder held in both hands. He read slowly. He read the page with his family name on it twice. Then he closed the folder and stood looking at the concrete floor of the shed. His great-great-grandfather had had the same warning available to him that Caleb Vane had written down and acted on. The same drought, the same land, the same pattern in the intervals, the same low corners on the same type of ground. Edward Hurst had not seen it, or had seen it and not acted, and the farm had been lost and rebuilt across 2 generations, and Dale had spent his entire adult life on land that should never have been lost in the first place. And in April, he had pulled his truck to the shoulder of the county road and leaned out the window and told a 15-year-old boy that he was digging up his best flat ground. He handed the folder back to Patricia. He thanked her for coming to him first. His voice was level and quiet. Patricia drove back to Salina. Dale stood in the equipment shed for a long time after she left. Marcus came in looking for a socket wrench and found him standing still in the middle of the shed with his hands at his sides, not moving, not reaching for anything. Marcus looked at him and decided not to ask. The pond on the Hurst property was sealed and holding water before the ground froze hard in January. Dale drove past the Vane place on a Thursday morning and pulled in and parked near the barn, and Eli came out because he knew the sound of that engine. They walked together to the edge of the Vane pond. The water had a skim of ice at the shallow margins, but the center was open and dark and still in the winter cold. I read what she found. Dale said, "The pages." "I know," Eli said. "She told me she was going to you first." Dale looked at the water for a long moment. "My family lost this land once," he said. "In 1895, my grandfather bought it back piece by piece over 30 years. I grew up knowing something had been lost and rebuilt, but I never knew why it had been lost. My grandfather didn't talk about it." Eli said nothing. "Your great-great-grandfather wrote down what happened to every farm around him," Dale said, "including mine. He knew, and he wrote it down, and he sealed it in that crate, and nobody found it for 130 years. A silence that had some weight to it. He wrote it so someone would know." Eli said, "He didn't know when it would be found or who would find it. He just wanted it to be there if someone looked." Dale turned and looked at him directly. "You found it." "I was clearing storm damage," Eli said. "Luck is part of it." Dale shook his head once, slowly. It was not the gesture of a man who agreed. They stood at the pond for a few more minutes. The cold was real, and the sky was the low, committed gray of a plains winter, clouds that absorbed the light rather than releasing it, making the afternoon feel further along than it was. The willows along the north bank were bare, their branches thin and dark against the gray, but the root structure beneath the bank was deep and woven through the clay and would not be moved by anything the winter brought. "I have a question for you," Dale said. Eli waited. "Come spring, when I begin the clay lining on my pond," Dale said, "I want to do it the way yours was done, properly, not just what the crew figures out on their own." He paused. "I would like you to show me." Eli looked at the pond. He was 15 years old, and the man asking him was 63 and had farmed Harrowbend County since before Eli was born. There was something in the request that required a moment to receive. "Yes, sir," he said. "I can do that." Dale nodded. He walked to his truck and drove out to the county road. Patricia Webb's report on the Harrow Bend drought, the water retention methods employed on the Vane property, and the historical context of Caleb Vane's 1891 journal was published in the Kansas County Agricultural Extension newsletter in February. It was the most requested document the newsletter had ever distributed. The county extension office received inquiries from 3 adjacent counties and one from the state agricultural department in Topeka, which was considering including the water retention methodology in a revised best practices guide for small family farm operations. Patricia had written the introduction with care. She cited Caleb Vane by name and included the 4 underlined words in full with their context. She described the pond, the clay liner, the willow planting, the gravity-fed irrigation channel, the creek measurements, the bird observations, all of it in the plain, useful language of someone who wants information to be actionable rather than admired. She included a brief account of the recovery of the missing pages from the county archive and what they documented about the 1894 drought's aftermath, using general language about neighboring properties rather than naming the Hearst family. Dale had never asked her to do this. She had simply judged it the right thing, and the judgment was correct. Howard Briggs's 1978 pamphlet, the one distributed at a county fair and politely disregarded, was reprinted as an appendix to Patricia's report. The Extension Office noted in a footnote that Briggs's drought cycle analysis had been substantially accurate and had preceded the formal academic literature on the subject by more than a decade. Howard Briggs had been dead for 11 years and had no surviving family in the county. But Mrs. Crane found a photograph of him in the local Historical Society's collection, a man in his 50s standing in front of a field and squinting at the camera with the expression of someone asked to hold still when he would rather be moving. She framed it and put it on the reference table near the front of the library. It seemed like the right thing to do. In the spring, Eli turned 16. He did not feel different than he had at 15, which was itself a kind of answer about what the year had asked of him and what it had taken. The pond was entering its 2nd year, and the willows were leafing out with the authority of established trees rather than newly planted saplings, their roots now woven through the clay bank in a system that would outlast the trees themselves. The water level had recovered fully and sat near its designed maximum. Fed by the winter rains and the slow return of the aquifer to something approaching its normal depth, he planted the north field in early April and the south field 2 weeks later, working the soil the way his father had taught him, reading the moisture content in each section before deciding on seed depth. The ground around the pond and along the irrigation channel had a quality now that the surrounding fields did not quite have, darker and more cohesive, holding its structure better after rain and releasing moisture more slowly in dry stretches. A second season of the pond's influence was doing what the first had begun. Thomas worked beside him on more days than the previous spring. He did not mention this. He simply appeared in the field each morning with his tools and worked until the afternoon and went in. And Eli understood that this was also a thing his father was saying without words. Silas broke ground on his water retention project in March, using 2 low sections on the north side of his property. He had read the extension reports and the reprinted Briggs pamphlet through the winter and requested additional documents from the state agricultural library. And by the time the ground was workable, he knew what he needed to know. He didn't need much guidance from Eli, only another set of eyes on 2 Saturday mornings to confirm the grades and the inlet orientations. On the 2nd Saturday, Silas's nephew from Pratt County was there again, the same young man who had stood at the Vane Pond in July with his own failing well. He had driven 3 hours to watch and ask questions, and by the end of the afternoon had enough to begin planning something similar on his own land. Ruth Ingram, who farmed 60 acres on the county's western edge, called the Vane house in late March and asked if Eli would come look at her property. She was in her 60s, a practical and direct woman who had worked alone since her husband's death 7 years before. She showed him 3 potential sites without preamble and asked which one made the most sense. He walked all 3 and told her, standing in the low corner of her east field with the spring mud working into his boots. She listened and asked 2 questions that were exactly the right questions, and then thanked him and asked what she owed him for his time. "Nothing," he said. "It is not that kind of thing." She looked at him steadily for a moment. Then she said she understood and that she would remember it. 3 weeks later, a jar of preserved peaches appeared on the Vane porch without a note, and Martha brought it inside and put it in the kitchen without comment, which was her way of acknowledging that some debts are paid in forms that don't require a receipt. The Hearst pond was operational by late April. Dale had hired the same crew back to help with the clay lining, and Eli had come over on 2 afternoons to work alongside them and answer questions about technique. The pond was 3 times the size of the vein pond because Dale had 3 times the land and the resources to do it without the improvisation that necessity had required on the vein property. Watching the crew work efficiently on a scale that would have taken him months working alone, Eli felt something clean and uncomplicated. Not envy. Satisfaction at watching a method proven in difficult circumstances work correctly under better conditions. On the afternoon, the Hearst pond held its first full foot of water. Dale called Eli over to look at it. They stood at the edge in the late April light. The pond was still raw, the banks bare earth. No willows planted yet, the clay liner faintly visible in the shallows where the water had not yet clouded it. But it held. The water sat still and dark, and it held. Dale looked at it for a long time without speaking. "My grandfather would have known what this took," he said finally. Eli looked at the water. He rebuilt what was lost. Dale said, without knowing why it had been lost, without knowing what had happened in 1894, he just knew that ground needed to be reclaimed, and he did the work of reclaiming it. He was that kind of man. Eli said. Dale nodded slowly, the kind who works without certainty that the work will matter. They stood there as the afternoon light moved across the new water. A meadowlark landed on the bare bank at the far end of the pond, assessed the situation with the frank efficiency of a bird that has things to do, and began to sing. "Your great-great-grandfather wrote down what he knew," Dale said, "put it in a box and trusted that someone would find it." "Yes, sir. And now you know it too." There was a silence that held without pressure. "I'm writing it down," Eli said. Dale turned and looked at him. "I started a notebook in February of last year," Eli said. "Creek measurements, soil observations, what worked and what did not. I have been adding to it since the drought. Things I figured out by doing them that the extension reports did not quite cover. You intend to leave it somewhere someone will find it," Dale said. "I intend to leave it somewhere my children will find it." Eli said, "If I have children, and their children, and whoever comes after that." Dale looked at him with the most unguarded expression Eli had ever seen on the older man's face. Not sentiment, not the softness of someone moved by an idea, but the more serious look of someone in the presence of something true. The way a man looks when a thing lands in him rather than passing over. He put his hand out. Eli shook it. In Harrowbend, that meant something had been agreed to that did not require further words. The spring planting went in across the county with a different quality of attention than it had the year before. People checked creek levels now. They looked at their low corners not as waste ground but as possibility, as places where water could be held and time could be bought against the next dry year. Whenever it came, Silas Park put a measuring stake in his creek in March and checked it weekly. 2 other farmers did the same. The information they gathered would be useless in the good years and irreplaceable in the bad ones. And the point was not to know which kind of year this would be, but to be ready for both. That was how it had always worked. Going back to Caleb Vane and further, going back to every person who had ever paid careful and patient attention to a piece of ground they depended on. The observations accumulated. The knowledge moved forward through the years in the containers people chose to put it in. Journals and ledgers and notebooks and whatever came after those. And the ones who found it and understood it had an advantage that looked like wisdom from the outside, but was actually closer to listening. Patricia published a second article in the summer newsletter about the recovery of the willow root systems at the Vane Pond and their effect on bank stability through the freeze and thaw cycles. She sent Eli a draft before submission, and he read it and made 2 corrections and sent it back. She made the corrections and thanked him in the acknowledgement section. He was not certain how he felt about being acknowledged in an agricultural extension newsletter at 16. But Martha read the acknowledgement with an expression that told him she was satisfied, and that was sufficient. The county held a drought preparedness meeting in June, organized by the Extension Office and attended by more farmers than anyone had anticipated. Patricia presented the water retention methodology. Eli sat in the back of the room and answered questions when they were directed to him, which happened several times in a way that was slightly uncomfortable and entirely understandable. He was the demonstration. He was the thing that made the abstract feel possible. Silas sat beside him, and occasionally, when a question came that Eli was taking a moment to think through, offered a piece of information from his own winter of reading that added to the answer without competing with it. They had developed, over the drought year and its aftermath, the easy collaboration of people who think differently enough from each other to be useful. Driving home on the county road in the late evening light after the meeting, Eli slowed without quite deciding to when he passed the Vane property. He could see the pond from the road now. He had not been able to see it from the road in April of the previous year when it was a staked rectangle of turned dirt. Now it was visible, the dark water catching the last of the sky, the willows in full leaf along the north bank. A heron standing at the margin with the absolute stillness of a creature that has learned that waiting is a form of action. He drove on. At home, he went to the barn and got his notebook from the shelf where he kept it and brought it inside and sat at the kitchen table under the same light where he had sat the previous February reading Caleb's journal. He opened to the current section and read back through what he had written since the previous winter. The creek measurements and the soil observations and the notes from the drought and the things that had worked and the things that had not worked and why. He added 2 observations from the meeting that evening, things other farmers had said that seemed worth preserving. Then he wrote the date and closed the notebook. Thomas came in from outside, poured coffee, and sat across the table. He looked at the notebook with its worn spine and swelled pages. "Getting full," he said. "I will need a new one soon," Eli said. Thomas set his cup down on the table. He looked across at his son in the kitchen light, a boy who was almost not a boy anymore, who had spent a year doing something that most of the county had laughed at and had been right about it in a way that the county would not finish reckoning with for years. "Your great-great-grandfather went through 3 of them," Thomas said. "Over about 30 years. They were all in the crate." Eli looked up. He had found only one. He had assumed the one was all there was. "Where are the others?" he said. Thomas set down his coffee and stood and went to the cabinet above the kitchen desk. He moved the folder of important documents aside and reached to the back of the shelf and brought out 2 cloth-wrapped bundles, smaller than the first, bound with the same brittle twine. "Your mother found them when she reorganized the cabinet last winter," he said. "We thought you might want to find them yourself when the time felt right." He set them on the table in front of Eli and went back to his coffee. Eli sat with the 2 bundles in front of him for a moment. Then he untied the first one carefully and opened it and read the first line of the first entry. It was dated August of 1898, Caleb Vane writing 4 years after the drought, the same cramped, deliberate hand pressing hard into the paper, the hand of a man who wants the words to stay. "The creek is running full this summer," Caleb had written. "The neighbors who left have not come back. The ones who stayed are learning things they should have known before. I am writing them down." Outside, the Kansas night was warm and still, and the pond sat full in the dark at the far end of the field, holding what it held. Somewhere along the north bank, where the willows stood in the dark with their roots deep in the clay, a frog began to sing, then another, then more, until the sound of them filled the summer air the way water fills a well-made basin, completely and without hurry, as if it had always been there and had every intention of staying. Eli turned the page and kept reading.